What happened to those old Betty Crocker dinner recipes nobody cooks anymore? For years, these meals were the backbone of family tables, filling kitchens with casseroles, bakes, and hearty plates that kept households fed night after night. If they mattered that much then, why did we let them disappear? Vienna sausage casserole was one of those thrifty creations that Betty Crocker promoted in the mid-century when canned goods were at the center of nearly every meal. Housewives opened a few cans of Vienna sausages, sliced them, and baked them in a tomato base with noodles to make the dish feel substantial. It was inexpensive, filling, and easy to prepare, which made it ideal for busy families who wanted comfort without expense. Children often enjoyed the novelty of the small sausages, while adults saw it as a clever way to stretch pantry staples into a full dinner. Advertisements and cookbooks praised it as a one-dish meal, requiring little more than a can opener and a casserole pan. It was not glamorous, but it reflected the resourceful spirit of post-war America, when convenience and frugality shaped much of the home kitchen. Vienna sausage casserole may sound strange today, but it once stood as a symbol of mid-century ingenuity and the desire to feed families well with very little. Chicken and rice ring was a dinner showpiece, though it came from simple and affordable ingredients. Housewives prepared a molded ring of rice, baking it into shape, then filled the center with creamed chicken and mixed vegetables. It was a way to dress up ordinary ingredients in a presentation that looked elegant on the table. Families loved the contrast of creamy filling against the firm rice, and it often appeared at dinner parties or Sunday gatherings. Betty Crocker cookbooks encouraged homemakers to use ring molds to elevate basic meals into something memorable, and this dish became a perfect example. It was both thrifty and impressive, which was exactly the balance that mid-century kitchens sought to strike. The chicken and rice ring carried the charm of the 1950s dinner table, where homemakers took pride in creating meals that pleased the eye as much as the palate. Today it is forgotten, but it once held an important place in American kitchens. Tuna Ring Supreme was another molded creation that reflected the playful experimentation of Betty Crocker recipes. Biscuit dough was shaped into a ring, baked, and then filled with a creamy mixture of tuna, peas, and a white sauce. It turned pantry staples into a dish that looked festive, something that could stand at the center of a dinner table. Families appreciated the practicality, since canned tuna was cheap and filling, while the biscuit crust gave the meal more weight. Children often liked the mild creaminess, though the peas were not always a favorite. The appeal of the Tuna Ring Supreme lay in its versatility, since homemakers could adjust the filling based on what was on hand. Cookbooks described it as a way to transform inexpensive food into something impressive, highlighting the importance of presentation in mid-century cooking. Today it seems quirky, but in its time it was a proud example of kitchen creativity and resourcefulness. Spaghetti pie was Betty Crocker's solution to leftover pasta, turning yesterday's meal into a brand new dish. Housewives mixed cooked spaghetti with eggs and cheese, pressing it into a pie pan to form a firm crust. The crust was then filled with tomato sauce, meat, or vegetables and baked until golden. It sliced neatly like a pie, making for a fun and tidy presentation that appealed to both adults and children. It was thrifty since it made use of leftovers, but also novel enough to feel special on a weeknight. Families loved the idea that a simple bowl of spaghetti could be reimagined as something entirely different. Advertisements promoted spaghetti pie as an Americanized take on Italian food, reflecting the era's fascination with adapting ethnic dishes to suit budgets. It may not be seen on many tables today, but spaghetti pie was once a staple of the Betty Crocker repertoire, combining thrift, creativity, and charm. Corned beef shortcake was a hearty and unusual dish that reflected the frugal tastes of mid-century kitchens. Biscuit dough was baked in layers, stacked, and filled with canned corned beef and thick gravy. It was a clever way to make canned meat stretch further, transforming it into something that resembled a layered main course. Families enjoyed its hearty richness, especially when paired with vegetables or potatoes. Betty Crocker cookbooks presented it as a creative alternative to traditional meat pies, emphasizing how homemakers could make something festive with humble ingredients. The shortcake format also gave the dish a novelty that children found appealing, while adults appreciated the economy of it. Corned beef shortcake captured the blend of practicality and presentation that defined the Betty Crocker style, making even the most modest ingredients feel more important on the table. Though it seems forgotten today, it was once a beloved way to turn pantry staples into satisfying dinners. Celery stuffed meatloaf was one of Betty Crocker's more inventive twists on a classic dish. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs and seasonings, rolled out flat, and then layered with celery stalks before being rolled back into a loaf. The result was a meatloaf that sliced to reveal a core of green celery running through the center. Families appreciated the freshness of the celery, which lightened the richness of the meat. It also allowed homemakers to stretch a pound of beef by filling it with inexpensive vegetables, making it both thrifty and nutritious. The presentation impressed guests, since the sliced loaf revealed something unexpected inside. Cookbooks of the time praised it as a practical yet elegant recipe, showing that even meatloaf could be dressed up for the dinner table. Celery stuffed meatloaf may sound unusual today, but it perfectly embodied Betty Crocker's mission of helping homemakers create meals that were resourceful, attractive, and family-friendly. Frankfurter Crown Roast was one of those whimsical Betty Crocker creations that showed off the playful side of 1950s kitchens. Hot dogs were split and tied together in a circle, creating the shape of a crown, and then filled in the center with creamy mashed potatoes. The presentation was dramatic, especially for such humble ingredients, and families often marveled at the creativity. Children were delighted by the combination since hot dogs were already a favorite, and mashed potatoes made the dish feel complete. Adults appreciated the thriftiness since both ingredients were inexpensive and readily available. Cookbooks featured the Frankfurter Crown Roast as a fun recipe for parties or casual gatherings, where it could serve as both centerpiece and main course. It captured the Betty Crocker ethos of making something ordinary look extraordinary through presentation alone. Though rarely seen today, the Frankfurter Crown Roast remains a fascinating reminder of how homemakers used imagination to stretch budgets and keep family meals exciting. Creamed chicken in patty shells was a recipe that highlighted the balance between thrift and elegance in Betty Crocker's kitchens. Puff pastry shells were baked until golden, then filled with a rich creamed chicken mixture. The result looked sophisticated, as though it belonged in a restaurant, yet it was built from inexpensive staples like milk, flour, and leftover chicken. Families loved the contrast of flaky pastry with creamy filling, and it became a popular choice for dinner parties or Sunday suppers. It gave homemakers the satisfaction of serving something that looked refined without requiring costly ingredients. Cookbooks often promoted it as a dish that allowed ordinary households to enjoy food that felt special, reflecting the aspirational side of mid-century cooking. Creamed chicken in patty shells symbolized the idea that thrift did not mean plainness. Presentation and technique could make all the difference. Though it has faded from popularity, it once stood proudly as a Betty Crocker favorite. Liver dumpling soup was one of the more old-fashioned recipes that lingered in Betty Crocker cookbooks, rooted in European traditions. Ground liver was mixed with breadcrumbs and seasonings, formed into small dumplings, and simmered in broth. The result was hearty, economical, and rich in nutrients, though its flavor was not to everyone's taste. Families who grew up with it often remembered it fondly, while others avoided it altogether. Betty Crocker included it as a reminder of immigrant influences that shaped American cooking, particularly in communities where thrift was essential. The soup provided protein at a low cost and made use of organ meats that were inexpensive and readily available. Homemakers who prepared liver dumpling soup valued its practicality, even if children sometimes resisted it. It reflected the no-waste ethos of earlier generations, carrying forward traditions that valued using every part of the animal. Though rarely cooked today, it was once a practical staple in many homes. Ring around the tuna may be one of the most infamous Betty Crocker recipes, a molded lime gelatin dish filled with canned tuna, vegetables, and mayonnaise. It was presented in glossy advertisements and cookbooks as a sophisticated modern meal that combined sweet, savory, and creamy flavors. Housewives were encouraged to use gelatin molds to elevate basic ingredients into stylish showpieces, and this dish fit the trend perfectly. Families often reacted with curiosity, and while some appreciated its novelty, others considered it an acquired taste. The visual impact of the bright green ring filled with tuna was striking, which made it popular for luncheons and gatherings. It represented the bold experimentation of the era, when convenience foods and modern techniques were celebrated as symbols of progress. Ring around the tuna may be remembered today as quirky or even unappealing, but in its time, it was praised for its creativity. It remains one of the most distinctive Betty Crocker creations of the mid-century. Salmon Wiggle was a dish that brought together convenience, thrift, and comfort, using canned salmon, peas, and a simple white sauce. Homemakers simmered the mixture until creamy, then served it generously over toast or crackers, creating a filling dinner from humble pantry staples. It was a favorite in post-war kitchens because it required no fresh fish and relied on ingredients that could be stored for months without spoiling. Children liked the mild creaminess, while adults valued its practicality and affordability. Betty Crocker cookbooks encouraged variations, sometimes adding celery or onions to stretch the dish further. It was promoted as modern, quick, and nourishing, perfectly fitting the decade's enthusiasm for efficiency in the kitchen. Though its name may sound quaint today, Salmon Wiggle captured the spirit of mid-century cooking, when thrift was balanced with creativity, and even the simplest meal could feel comforting at the family table. It has largely disappeared, but once it was a beloved way to make seafood accessible to every household. Ham and banana roll-ups were one of the more adventurous Betty Crocker creations, reflecting the playful experimentation of the 1950s. Thin slices of ham were wrapped around peeled bananas, placed in a baking dish and smothered with a creamy cheese sauce before baking. The combination of salty ham, sweet banana, and rich cheese sauce was unusual, but it stood out in mid-century cookbooks as a creative dish meant to surprise guests. Families had mixed feelings about the pairing, but homemakers appreciated that it used inexpensive ingredients to create something memorable. The dish was presented as both thrifty and showy, fitting well into the trend of recipes that emphasized novelty as much as taste. Though few would consider making it today, ham and banana roll-ups were once a proud example of how Betty Crocker promoted fun and imagination in the kitchen. It was a dish meant to impress through presentation and boldness, even if the flavors puzzled modern palates. Cheese soufflé casserole was Betty Crocker's way of bringing elegance into the home kitchen without requiring costly ingredients. Housewives whipped egg whites until airy, folded them into cheddar cheese, and baked the mixture until it puffed golden and light. The dish looked refined, as though it belonged in a fine restaurant, but it was made from ordinary pantry items like eggs, milk, and cheese. Families enjoyed the texture, which was fluffy yet filling, making it suitable for dinner or special gatherings. Magazines promoted it as a recipe for women who wanted to serve something impressive while still staying within budget. Its popularity reflected the post-war fascination with French-influenced cooking, which was often adapted for American tastes. The soufflé casserole carried an aspirational quality, allowing homemakers to present a meal that felt sophisticated and modern. Though rarely cooked today, it was once a proud centerpiece of Betty Crocker's repertoire, blending thrift and refinement into a dish that captured the imagination of mid-century households. Deviled ham salad mold was a distinctly mid-century creation that highlighted the era's love affair with gelatin molds. Deviled ham was blended with mayonnaise, chopped pickles, and seasonings, then set into a lime or lemon-flavored gelatin base to form a decorative shape. When unmolded, it was served as both salad and centerpiece, often at luncheons or family gatherings. Families admired the presentation, even if the combination of savory ham and sweet gelatin was divisive in taste. Betty Crocker cookbooks praised it as a way to elevate inexpensive ingredients into something striking and memorable. It was part of a larger trend in which gelatin was used to create festive molds that doubled as decor and dinner. While it may seem odd today, the deviled ham salad mold reflected the playful, experimental spirit of its time. It was a dish designed to impress visually and demonstrate a homemaker's creativity, even if its flavors puzzled guests. It remains one of Betty Crocker's most curious mid-century recipes. Potato turrets were a simple but showy way of turning mashed potatoes into something special for dinner. Housewives piped mashed potatoes into tall, decorative shapes, often using a pastry bag, and baked them until the edges browned and crisped. The result was both practical and beautiful, offering familiar comfort food in an elegant presentation. Families enjoyed the contrast between the crispy outside and soft inside, and the shapes made the dish appealing to children as well. Betty Crocker cookbooks encouraged homemakers to use potato turrets as side dishes for roasts or poultry, adding sophistication to otherwise plain meals. The idea fit perfectly into the 1950s obsession with presentation, where even ordinary foods were expected to look impressive on the table. Potato turrets were thrifty since they used leftovers, but they also allowed homemakers to showcase creativity. Though rarely seen today, they once stood as a charming reminder of how mid-century kitchens combined simplicity with a flair for style. Chicken mousse mold was one of the many gelatin-based dishes that tried to bring elegance into the mid-century dining room. Pureed chicken was blended with cream, seasonings, and gelatin, then chilled in a decorative mold until firm. The result was sliced and served as a main dish, often garnished with vegetables or parsley. Families viewed it as sophisticated, though its texture was not universally loved. Betty Crocker cookbooks promoted it as an economical way to make a little chicken go further, stretching protein with inexpensive fillers. It also fit neatly into the decade's fascination with molded foods, which were seen as modern and stylish. The chicken mousse mold represented the era's push to blend thrift, convenience, and presentation into one dish. Though the idea may seem dated now, it once carried an air of refinement and showed the lengths homemakers would go to impress guests. It was a product of its time, combining practicality with aspiration. Stuffed prune roast was a Betty Crocker dish that combined sweet and savory in ways that reflected mid-century tastes. A pork roast was sliced open and filled with prunes, then roasted until tender, creating a dish where the fruit's sweetness balanced the richness of the meat. Families enjoyed the contrast, which felt both hearty and festive. The use of prunes was practical, since they were inexpensive and widely available, while also adding nutrition and moisture to the roast. Betty Crocker cookbooks encouraged homemakers to try recipes like this to bring variety to the dinner table without raising costs. It often appeared at Sunday dinners or holiday gatherings, where it served as a thrifty but impressive centerpiece. The stuffed prune roast reflected the post-war trend of experimenting with fruit in savory dishes, a hallmark of the era's adventurous spirit. Though rarely cooked today, it stood as a proud example of creativity and thrift combined in one dish. Spiced tongue loaf was an economical recipe that demonstrated the mid-century habit of using every cut of meat. Beef tongue was simmered until tender, then ground and mixed with spices before being pressed into a loaf pan and baked. The loaf was sliced and served cold, often as a main dish or sandwich filler. Families valued it for its thriftiness, since tongue was inexpensive compared to premium cuts. Betty Crocker cookbooks praised it as both nutritious and practical, encouraging homemakers to waste nothing. The loaf carried a firm, savory flavor, though its appeal depended on the family's comfort with organ meats. It was the kind of dish that reflected earlier immigrant traditions while adapting to mid-century American tastes. Spiced tongue loaf may sound unusual today, but it once fit squarely into the Betty Crocker mission of creating resourceful meals from affordable ingredients. It was a reminder that nothing went to waste in a thrifty kitchen. Eggplant tower bake was Betty Crocker's way of introducing a meatless dinner that still felt hearty and satisfying. Slices of eggplant were layered with breadcrumbs, tomato sauce, and cheese, stacked into a tower that baked into a bubbly golden dish. The presentation made it appealing, while the flavors gave families a filling alternative to meat-centered meals. It was especially popular in areas with Italian-American influence, where eggplant dishes were common. Betty Crocker cookbooks promoted it as thrifty and nutritious, pointing to vegetables as budget stretchers during leaner weeks. Homemakers appreciated how it allowed them to serve something different while keeping costs low. Eggplant tower bake reflected the 1950s focus on variety and creativity, proving that vegetables could serve as the centerpiece of dinner. It was a forward-looking recipe in its time, encouraging families to enjoy meatless meals without feeling deprived. Though it has faded from kitchens, it once carried both charm and practicality. Curried shrimp casserole was one of the more exotic dishes in the Betty Crocker repertoire, reflecting America's mid-century fascination with international flavors. Shrimp was baked in a creamy sauce seasoned with curry powder, then served over rice. The curry flavor was mild, adapted for American tastes, but it gave the dish a touch of novelty. Families enjoyed it as a break from ordinary casseroles, and it often appeared at dinner parties or special gatherings. Betty Crocker cookbooks presented it as both sophisticated and practical, since frozen or canned shrimp could be used when fresh seafood was unavailable. The dish embodied the era's curiosity with foreign flavors while still staying firmly within the comfort zone of cream sauces and rice. It showed how homemakers could add excitement to the dinner table without abandoning thrift. Curried shrimp casserole remains a curious reminder of how Betty Crocker helped introduce bold flavors into the mainstream American kitchen of the 1950s. Mock duck was Betty Crocker's thrifty answer to elegant roasts, made from ground beef and breadcrumbs rolled around a stuffing of bread, sage, and onion. It was baked and sliced to resemble duck breast, though it was entirely made of cheaper pantry staples. Families enjoyed it because it carried the flavor and presentation of something special while costing very little. Cookbooks often suggested serving it with gravy to enhance its richness and complete the illusion. Homemakers felt proud of creating a dish that looked impressive, even if everyone knew it was not real duck. It reflected the 1950s obsession with stretching meat and giving meals a sense of refinement through presentation. Mock duck stood as a clever compromise between aspiration and frugality, bringing elegance to the table when true luxury was out of reach. Though it has vanished from most kitchens, it once symbolized the resourcefulness that Betty Crocker recipes championed during the mid-century era. Sausage apple bake was a hearty casserole that reflected the American love for sweet and savory combinations. Pork sausage links were layered in a dish with sliced apples, brown sugar, and sometimes onions, then baked until caramelized and tender. The result was both comforting and economical, since it relied on inexpensive sausage and fruit that stored well through the winter. Families appreciated its balance of flavors, with the sweetness of apples softening the saltiness of the meat. Betty Crocker cookbooks promoted it as a cozy dinner fit for weeknights or Sunday suppers, showcasing how simple ingredients could create depth. It often appeared on autumn tables, taking advantage of seasonal apples and turning them into something filling. Homemakers praised it as reliable, frugal, and satisfying for the whole family. Today it might sound unusual, but in its time, sausage apple bake perfectly fit the trend of creative casseroles that defined mid-century cooking, where economy and flavor met in a single dish. Bologna boat was one of Betty Crocker's quirkiest creations, turning an everyday lunch meat into a dinner centerpiece. A thick slice of bologna was hollowed into a bowl shape, filled with seasoned mashed potatoes, and baked until the edges crisped. Sometimes cheese or breadcrumbs were added to the filling to make it feel more substantial. Families enjoyed the novelty of eating what looked like a little edible boat on their plates. It was inexpensive, playful, and surprisingly filling, making it a clever way to stretch budgets while still serving something interesting. Children often liked it because of its fun appearance, while adults appreciated that it turned basic bologna into something resembling a complete meal. Betty Crocker cookbooks encouraged homemakers to think creatively with affordable meats, and this dish embodied that advice. Though it may seem odd today, the bologna boat was once a proud part of mid-century cooking, showcasing ingenuity with even the simplest pantry items. Veal birds were a Betty Crocker classic that added refinement to a frugal dinner. Thin slices of veal were spread with a bread-based stuffing, rolled tightly, tied with string, and simmered slowly in brown gravy. The result was tender, savory, and visually appealing, especially when sliced on the plate. Families enjoyed how the stuffing stretched the meat further, creating a dish that felt generous without requiring much veal. It was a recipe that reflected immigrant influences, blending old-world technique with American practicality. Betty Crocker presented it as an ideal company dish, since its presentation looked far more impressive than its cost. For homemakers in the 1950s, veal birds allowed them to serve meals that felt sophisticated while still being thrifty. Though rarely cooked today, they embodied the mid-century desire to balance elegance, economy, and creativity at the dinner table, proving that even modest cuts could be turned into something special with effort. Cheddar-topped Spam loaf was a proud showcase of how Betty Crocker recipes made the best of processed meats. Spam was pressed into a loaf pan, baked until firm, and topped with a sharp cheddar cheese crust that bubbled golden in the oven. It was thrifty since Spam was inexpensive and readily available, yet the addition of cheese made it feel indulgent. Families appreciated its salty, savory flavor and the way it sliced neatly for dinner or sandwiches. Cookbooks presented it as both convenient and satisfying, especially during weeks when fresh meat was costly or unavailable. It captured the post-war fascination with processed foods, celebrating their reliability and affordability. Homemakers valued the sense of comfort it provided, even if it came from canned meat. Today, it might be considered quirky, but cheddar-topped Spam loaf was once a beloved way to stretch budgets and still serve something that felt hearty and complete. Curried rice ring was a dish that reflected both thrift and novelty in Betty Crocker kitchens. Rice was baked in a molded ring, then filled with a creamed mixture of vegetables, sometimes with bits of meat or seafood. Curry powder added an exotic flair, making the dish feel more adventurous while still inexpensive. Families liked its striking presentation, with the golden ring encircling a creamy, colorful filling. It was both frugal and fashionable, embodying the mid-century fascination with molded foods and international-inspired flavors. Homemakers appreciated how easily it could be made ahead of time and served as a centerpiece at dinners or luncheons. Betty Crocker cookbooks encouraged the use of ring molds to elevate simple staples, and this dish was a prime example. Curried rice ring has mostly vanished from tables, but in its day, it symbolized resourcefulness paired with creativity, turning humble rice into something worthy of pride. Prune whip with meatballs was one of the more unusual Betty Crocker pairings, blending sweet and savory in ways that challenged expectations. Prune whip, made by whipping stewed prunes with sugar and egg whites into a frothy dessert, was served alongside savory meatballs as part of a dinner plate. The combination was meant to balance richness with lightness, offering contrast in both flavor and texture. Families often found it curious but memorable, especially in regions where fruit-based sides were common. Cookbooks described it as economical, since prunes were inexpensive and meat could be stretched into small portions. Homemakers valued the creativity, even if the pairing raised eyebrows. It was part of the experimental spirit of mid-century cooking, when novelty often took precedence over tradition. Prune whip with meatballs has not survived into modern kitchens, but it reflects the quirky ingenuity of Betty Crocker recipes that encouraged homemakers to surprise their families with unexpected combinations at dinner. Oyster stew casserole was Betty Crocker's take on a classic coastal favorite, transformed into a baked dish for mid-century families. Fresh or canned oysters were combined with cream, butter, and breadcrumbs, then baked until bubbling and golden. The result was rich and comforting, offering the flavor of a stew but the heartiness of a casserole. Families who lived far from the coast appreciated that canned oysters made the dish accessible even in rural areas. Homemakers served it as a special dinner, sometimes for holidays or company, since oysters were considered a treat. The casserole format reflected the 1950s obsession with baking everything into one dish that could feed a family with minimal fuss. Betty Crocker praised it as both practical and impressive, allowing homemakers to offer seafood in an affordable, approachable way. Oyster stew casserole may seem unusual now, but it once carried the prestige of seafood while staying firmly within the frugal mid-century kitchen ethos. Pineapple-baked ham loaf was a mid-century favorite that paired sweet fruit with savory meat in classic Betty Crocker style. Ground ham was shaped into a loaf, topped with pineapple slices, and glazed with syrup before baking. The result was both thrifty and festive, turning inexpensive meat into a dinner centerpiece. Families loved the sweetness of pineapple against the salty richness of ham, making it popular for Sunday meals or gatherings. Betty Crocker promoted it as a dish that looked impressive, but required only pantry staples and a bit of canned fruit. Its appeal came from the balance of flavor and presentation, which transformed leftovers into something worthy of pride. Homemakers often relied on it during holidays when budgets were tight, but expectations remained high. Pineapple-baked ham loaf has disappeared from most kitchens, but it once embodied the optimism and creativity of post-war America, proving that canned goods could be both convenient and celebratory at the dinner table. Savory tongue pie was a resourceful Betty Crocker recipe that turned inexpensive organ meats into a comforting dinner. Chopped beef tongue was simmered, seasoned, and baked in a pie crust with onions and gravy, creating a dish that was both hearty and economical. Families enjoyed its richness, especially in communities where tongue was already familiar as part of traditional cooking. Homemakers valued it for making use of every part of the animal, reflecting the frugal ethos of the mid-century kitchen. Betty Crocker cookbooks praised savory tongue pie as a no-waste recipe that delivered flavor and substance on a budget. The pie format gave it familiarity, making even organ meat approachable for reluctant eaters. It was often served in colder months, when a filling, warming dinner was especially welcome. Though rarely prepared today, savory tongue pie once represented the practicality, thrift, and inventiveness that defined Betty Crocker's guidance for American households during the 1950s and 1960s. Cottage cheese and pineapple plates were the go-to for a light summer dinner when turning on the stove felt like punishment. You would scoop a generous mound of cottage cheese onto your plate, plop some pineapple rings or chunks right alongside, and maybe toss in a saltine cracker or two if you were feeling fancy. That was dinner. It sounds a little strange now, but back then it was right there in every old cookbook, promising quick, budget-friendly meals that helped stretch the pantry and beat the heat. It was cold, creamy, and sweet. The kind of meal that made sure you stayed full without sweating over a hot skillet. For families trying to get by on tight paychecks, it was a lifesaver. And somehow, that odd combination of tangy cottage cheese and syrupy pineapple rings actually worked. It might not win any culinary awards today, but during those lean years, it was exactly the kind of practical magic you needed. Eggs and milk, two of the most basic ingredients in any 1960s kitchen, were the foundation of a meal that felt more like a science experiment than dinner. Floating island dinner, as it was sometimes called, involved poaching eggs in a thin milk broth, then serving them over toast with a dusting of paprika. It was cheap, it was filling, and while it may have looked unusual, it made the most of what families had on hand. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and relatively inexpensive compared to meat. Poaching them in milk was a way to add richness without using butter or oil, and the broth itself didn't go to waste. It soaked into the toast, creating a soft, custard-like texture that was surprisingly satisfying. Paprika wasn't just for color. It added a hint of warmth and spice to an otherwise mild dish. This kind of meal had roots in old-fashioned frugality. Similar recipes had been around for generations, passed down from an era when every ingredient had to serve a purpose. For kids, it was a bit of a mystery. Why was dinner floating? But for parents, it was an easy, one-pan solution that turned a few simple staples into something warm and nourishing at the end of a long day. Back in the 1950s, the Divan Parisian restaurant at Chatham Hotel in New York City gave birth to its signature dish, the chicken divan casserole. This mouth-watering dish soon found its way to all our homes, and I'm not complaining. It's made of tender chicken pieces nestled amongst vibrant green broccoli florets, in a rich and creamy sauce, topped with a generous layer of melty cheese and a sprinkle of crispy breadcrumbs. The chef who leaked this recipe out to the public really took one for the team, and we can never thank him enough. It's the perfect combination of protein, veggies, and all the cheesy goodness your heart desires. Just maybe pair it with a side salad to pretend you're being healthy. Chicken divan casserole is the retro dish of every cheese lover's dreams, and you know what that calls for? A comeback. It's a classic at throwback parties, but you don't really need an excuse to cook this up. A typical Tuesday night works too. Salted fish and porridge is an example of an essential combination in medieval times. It was especially popular in coastal and northern regions. This is because preservation was a massive deal in those areas due to how they were always just dealing with rougher, colder climates. Also, it might be surprising, but fish was a religious pillar for people. The Catholic Church back then was the reigning religious authority, and it would impose all kinds of fast days, especially every Friday. See, here, any kind of meat was forbidden, except fish. The logic behind this is that the practice of fasting during Lent and on Fridays is to abstain from fleshly meat, but since fish are cold-blooded, they don't come into flesh meat. It's a technical exception. The porridge itself was something that would contrast very well with the fermented taste of the fish, and in some households, people were adding herbs, onions, and garlic as well. This was a dish that was always eaten out of necessity. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky, golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period, around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. Once a staple of dinner parties and homecoming feasts, this elegant yet simple side dish was a favorite among home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to their meals. Crisp, tender green beans, lightly sautéed in butter and finished with toasted almonds, struck the perfect balance between freshness and richness. Green beans were one of the most accessible vegetables in American kitchens. Whether fresh, frozen, or canned, they were affordable and widely available year-round. Almonds, though slightly more expensive, were used sparingly, adding a crunchy contrast without overwhelming the dish. The preparation was straightforward. The beans were quickly blanched to preserve their bright color and firm texture, then tossed in a buttery skillet with slivered almonds for a nutty, golden brown finish. Some recipes included a squeeze of lemon or a sprinkle of garlic for extra depth. But as convenience cooking took hold, green bean almondine slowly faded from dinner tables. Canned green bean casseroles, loaded with processed ingredients, became the new standard, and simple, fresh preparations were overlooked in favor of heavier, creamier alternatives. Scrapple was traditionally a way to use up leftover pork scraps, but when meat was scarce or too expensive, another version took its place, one that relied on sweet potatoes and cornmeal instead. Sweet potato scrapple kept the same fried, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside texture, but swapped out meat for mashed sweet potatoes, mixed with cornmeal and spices, then molded into a loaf and sliced before frying. It was simple, cheap, and packed with enough flavor to make you forget there wasn't any pork in sight. Sweet potatoes were a southern staple, affordable, nutritious, and easy to grow. Unlike white potatoes, they had a natural sweetness that made them versatile in both savory and sweet dishes. Combined with cornmeal, another low-cost kitchen essential, they created a filling, hearty meal that could be eaten on its own or served with eggs for breakfast. Seasonings varied by household. Some added cinnamon for warmth, others leaned into salt and pepper for a more savory bite. Families who grew up eating it remember the unmistakable sound of slices sizzling in a hot pan, the edges crisping up to golden perfection. Cracker-crusted sardine patties were about as close to seafood night as most working families ever got when money was tight. You would mash up a can of sardines, crush some saltine crackers, and mix the two until it held together just enough to form a patty. That patty went straight into a hot skillet with a little oil, frying up crisp on the outside and soft in the middle. It was not a fancy fish fillet from the market, but it was hot, salty, and filled your stomach fast. These little patties showed up all over those old cookbook pages from the 1930s to the 1970s because they were reliable, cheap, and fast. Most families topped them with mustard or a spoonful of relish, whatever scraps were left in the icebox. Nobody expected restaurant fare. These were survival meals dressed up to look halfway decent. Sardines were affordable, packed with protein, and did not spoil in the cupboard, which made them a go-to when you had to feed everyone with pennies to your name. 1950s buffet tables epitomizes the synergy between quick assembly and gratifying flavors. Historically, tuna skyrocketed in popularity after World War II when canned fish became a dependable staple in countless American households. The dish's appeal lies not only in its minimal ingredient list, but also in the crisp, refreshing texture that contrasts vibrantly with the creamy filling. Experts have often praised tuna's generous protein and essential nutrients, while home cooks appreciate the ability to whip up a family-friendly lunch with minimal fuss. Some quip that it's one of the few items that can hide wilted lettuce's questionable state, although a freshly washed bed of lettuce is always recommended. Indeed, the concept of presenting individual servings in lettuce cups dates back to an era enamored with elegant simplicity, an era that prized wholesome comfort over showy extravagance. By capitalizing on the combination of mayonnaise, crunchy celery, and subtle spices, this preparation delivers a taste that feels both nostalgic and contemporary. Long before store-bought bread was an everyday staple, cornmeal was the backbone of many working-class meals. Cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile, it found its way into countless recipes, none more practical than corn dodgers. These simple golden brown dumplings were either fried to crisp perfection or baked until firm, then served with a drizzle of syrup or a pat of butter. Corn dodgers were a direct descendant of Depression-era survival cooking, when wheat flour was too expensive for daily use. Cornmeal, on the other hand, was affordable and widely available, especially in the South and Midwest. Mixed with a little water, salt, and sometimes a splash of milk, it formed a dough sturdy enough to hold its shape in the frying pan. The result was a crispy on the outside, tender on the inside bite of pure comfort. Paired with a bit of molasses or honey, whatever was on hand, it became a meal that kids actually looked forward to. Some families made them dense and chewy, while others leaned toward a lighter, almost hush-puppy-like texture. However they were served, one thing was certain. Corn dodgers proved that even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something satisfying. No frills, no waste, just good, honest food. Stuffed peppers. Forget those boring pre-made things you see at the grocery store because stuffed peppers are here to save the day. We're talking about the beautiful bell peppers Grandma made on Thanksgiving. Vibrant red, yellow, or orange peppers are hand-picked and carefully hollowed out and then stuffed with a flavorful mixture of fluffy rice, seasoned ground meat, and your choice of chopped vegetables. Once stuffed, these peppers are baked to perfection until they are tender and crisp. Now, this isn't just a casual meal. Whipping up a stuffed pepper might make you feel like a master chef in the kitchen. It's also a great way to use up leftover rice and ground meat. Bonus points. If you use their visual appeal to trick your children into getting their daily dose of veggies. Yeah, the little ones don't really go for the green peppers on the table, but they might just love these stuffed peppers. You might even add some cheese to top it off. Unfortunately, it is one of those dishes that has faded from many dinner tables. If you've ever had split pea soup or peas pudding, then you might be interested to know that it actually originated from peas porridge. It was a dish that was really high in calories, but it was also really filled with protein. This was even better for people growing up because back in the medieval times, if you did not happen to live near any huntable game or were not rich, you could simply forget about having any kind of meat. The taste of this was still okay enough without it, but it was better when there were bits here and there. It's actually something that most people thought was really comforting, and it was why people invested in growing peas. Peas were convenient because even cottagers and small-time families could start to grow them. When famines would hit, peas were one of the kinds of legumes that could grow even when other grains simply could not. Break time. 1 second. Bright, tangy, and effortlessly elegant lemon chicken piccata was once a dinner table favorite. With its delicate balance of citrus, butter, and briny capers, this dish turned simple ingredients into something refined. Italian-American families popularized it in mid-century kitchens, and by the 1960s, it had become a go-to recipe for home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to a weeknight meal. Chicken was an economical protein, but before boneless, skinless cuts were widely available, whole birds had to be broken down by hand. Piccata was traditionally made with thinly pounded chicken breasts, quickly dredged in flour and sautéed until golden. The sauce was the star, fresh lemon juice and capers combined with a silky butter reduction to create a dish that was light yet deeply flavorful. It was often served with pasta or rice, making it both practical and satisfying. So why did this dish vanish from home kitchens? Over time, complex flavors gave way to simpler, more standardized meals. The rise of processed sauces and pre-made chicken dishes made from scratch piccata seemed like more effort than it was worth. Black bread and ripping is one of those dishes that may not have any specific, notable history with it, but one that says something about the people that make it. First, let's start with what black bread is. It was the everyday bread of the citizens and rural folk of Northern and Eastern Europe. From Russia to Scandinavia and Poland, black bread, this distinctly dark, coarse bread made out of rye, bran, and maslin, was an incredibly hard bread. It would stale quickly, and back then, they didn't even have that many preservatives. Still, it was one of the few kinds of sustainable breads people could make with the grains they had. So what were they to do? People were going to adapt, that's what. And adapt they did. This is where dripping comes in. It's just lard, by the way, but it would transform the texture of the bread. What was just a hard and rough loaf of bread would suddenly soften, become warmer, and become a lot better to bite into. The crispy brown pits in the roast pan would have been mixed in, and they really added to the vibe of the dish a lot more. The dripping flavor would also be different depending on what kind of animal people would use, and pork dripping was the most common one. So, there you have black bread and dripping, a dish that reminds you of how people will find any way to get by. Campbell's mushroom soup over toast was one of those forgotten Depression-era dinners that somehow made a quiet comeback in old cookbooks from the 1940s through the 70s. It was as simple as it sounds, but it filled your belly fast. You opened a can of creamy mushroom soup, heated it up in a pot, and spooned it over slices of buttered toast. That was dinner. It did not pretend to be anything fancy, but when the cupboards were almost empty and the clock was ticking, it got the job done. Families leaned on meals like this when money was tight and time was short. It turned one can of soup into a warm, filling meal that stretched across the table. Maybe you sprinkled some black pepper on top, maybe a little dried parsley, but most folks kept it plain. It soaked into the bread, made the whole kitchen smell like home, and filled you up after a long day. Those old cookbooks were full of meals like this, simple recipes that felt comforting without much effort. Funny how the humblest dinners tend to stick around the longest, even when everything else changes. Stretching ingredients wasn't just a skill in the 1960s, it was a necessity. When a handful of leftover meat and a few vegetables weren't enough for a full meal, they found new life inside a flaky pie crust, topped with a generous layer of mashed potatoes. Hoosier pie supper was an answer to the age-old question: what can we make with what we have? Midwestern families, especially in Indiana, had been making similar dishes for generations, influenced by their farming roots and a deep tradition of waste not cooking. Mashed potatoes were a constant in working-class households, cheap, filling, and easy to make in large batches. A single pie could take scraps of roast beef, bits of ham, or even just a few spoonfuls of vegetables and turn them into a meal hearty enough to satisfy a family after a long day's work. It was baked until golden brown, emerging from the oven as a warm, comforting dish that filled the house with a familiar, savory aroma. Served with a ladle of brown gravy, it was about making sure nothing went to waste. In an era where food stretched as far as a paycheck, this dish wasn't just frugal. It was common sense wrapped in a flaky crust. I can just imagine the satisfying experience of cutting through that tender beef with minimal effort. Swiss steak, a dinnertime classic that deserves a comeback. Where do I sign the petition? Lamb might seem like a fancy restaurant thing these days, But back in the day, it was a total dinnertime MVP. Lamb stew was a fan favorite at dinner parties back in the day, and I get the hype. Imagine the combination of melt-in-your-mouth lamb and an assortment of colorful vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and peas simmered in a rich, flavorful broth just begging to be soaked with some crusty bread. This is a dish that's guaranteed to warm you up from the inside out on a chilly day. Not to mention, it's surprisingly easy to make. Perfect for those nights when you want a delicious meal without spending hours in the kitchen. Just maybe don't tell your grandma you added a sprinkle of your favorite hot sauce. Some traditions are best left untouched. There was a time when Sunday dinner wasn't complete without a plate of slow-cooked, gravy-drenched pork chops. Smothered in rich, savory onion gravy and served alongside a heaping portion of mashed potatoes, this dish was a cornerstone of Southern home cooking. It was an experience, one that filled the kitchen with the unmistakable aroma of comfort. Pork was an affordable alternative to beef, making it a practical choice for families looking to stretch their grocery budget. Bone-in chops were particularly popular, as they were both flavorful and inexpensive. The slow cooking process allowed even the toughest cuts to become fork tender, absorbing the deep, savory notes of the seasoned gravy. Some cooks swore by a cast-iron skillet, while others let the dish simmer in a slow cooker for hours, ensuring the pork melted in your mouth. But as convenience foods and boneless, skinless meats took over the supermarket, this dish began to disappear. Quick-fix dinners replaced slow-simmered meals, and thick homemade gravies gave way to powdered mixes and canned alternatives. Today, smothered pork chops are a rare sight at the dinner table. But for those who remember the first bite of a perfectly tender chop covered in rich, peppery gravy, it's a dish worth revisiting. Apple and nut porridge was a delightful, nutritious dish that would be somewhere in between everyday food and a celebratory treat. Now see, porridge was something that had a lot of colorful variations in the medieval world. Typically, it would be made with oats and millet, but if that wasn't available, then people could also just use different kinds of grains like rye or barley. During harvest season is when the party would really get going, though. That's when people would have abundant access to fruits and nuts, and that's when porridge could be turned into something significantly more special than what they were used to. Wild and homegrown apples were incredibly reliable. They would thrive in pretty much most major European countries. Apple orchards were something that would be seen in most village commons and monasteries too. Apples would be chopped, sliced, and simmered until they were just a little bit sweet, and nuts would be crushed and stirred into the porridge. This was a great breakfast, but if you had honey, some warm spices, and a bit of cream, it was something fit for a feast. Baked bean and Frankfurter cups were one of those dinners that showed up when parents needed something fast, cheap, and guaranteed to make the kids smile. You sliced up hot dogs, stirred them into a bubbling pot of canned baked beans, and let the whole thing simmer together until it smelled good enough to fool everyone into thinking dinner took effort. You could scoop it into bowls or coffee mugs, hand everyone a spoon, and dinner was done before anyone had the chance to complain. This recipe came straight from those old community cookbooks and church bulletins, the ones filled with quick fixes and budget meals for families running on empty. It was salty, sweet, and hearty enough to stick to your ribs after a long day of work or school. Those beans and franks might not have been gourmet, but they filled the kitchen with warmth, and for 10 minutes of effort, that was a win. You would see this recipe clipped onto fridge doors or scribbled on index cards, passed down because it worked. It was comforting, cheap, and faster than takeout. A classic for busy homes making the best of what the pantry had left. At a glance, it looked like fried chicken on a stick. But take one bite, and the secret was out. There wasn't a shred of chicken in sight. In the 1960s, when poultry prices soared, working-class families in industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit turned to a clever alternative: skewered, breaded, and fried pork or veal, known as city chicken. The name was a bit of a joke. Chicken was considered a luxury in certain areas, but pork and veal, those were cheap, especially in regions with a strong meatpacking industry. But appearance mattered, and with a little ingenuity, cubed cuts of meat were threaded onto wooden skewers, giving the illusion of a drumstick. Once dredged in flour, dipped in egg wash, and coated in breadcrumbs, it was pan-fried until golden brown and crispy. Some families took it a step further, baking the skewers in a bit of broth for extra tenderness. Eastern European immigrants had been making versions of it since the early 20th century, and by the 1960s it was a staple at Sunday dinners and potlucks. It might not have been real chicken, but in a time when stretching a dollar mattered more than labels, it didn't need to be. Now, Swiss steak is like a warm hug from the past. This dish is all about slow-cooked, fall-apart tender beef bathed in a tangy tomato sauce. Think slow cooker vibes, but way before slow cookers were even a thing. Now, the Swiss steak is all about patience. The longer you simmer the beef, the more melt-in-your-mouth delicious it becomes. It's also the perfect way to use up that tougher cut of meat you accidentally grabbed at the store. If you grew up thinking this dish was from Switzerland, as the name suggests, now would be a good time for me to tell you your whole life was a lie. This technique of cooking up tender meat came from England, so they're the ones to thank for this meaty goodness. Side dishes were once as thoughtfully prepared as the main course, and few were as simple yet elegant as a well-roasted carrot medley. Coated in honey, butter, and a hint of cinnamon, this dish was a staple at homecoming dinners, adding a touch of natural sweetness to balance out heavier meats and casseroles. Carrots were a practical choice for home cooks. They were cheap, easy to store, and available year-round, making them a kitchen essential. Roasting them brought out their natural sugars, and when paired with honey and warm spices, they became more than just a side dish. They were a highlight. Some versions used maple syrup instead, while others incorporated fresh herbs for a more savory twist. No matter the variation, the result was always a vibrant, glossy medley of tender carrots with a flavor profile that felt both nostalgic and indulgent. As processed vegetable sides and microwave steamed bags took over grocery store shelves, many home cooks stopped roasting vegetables altogether. Instead of taking the time to caramelize their natural flavors, people opted for pre-cut and pre-cooked options. Baked turnips with herbs is an example of how even a simple and humble root vegetable can be turned into something that gets your kids at the table if you know what you're doing. Luckily, medieval-era cooks had a lot of room for trial and error, and they definitely learned a few things about working with turnips. While baking them was never as common as stewing or boiling them, it was extremely good. Households that had the privilege of a bake oven would abuse that luxury maliciously, in fact. That's just how nice it was. In households where that wasn't a thing, Tay turnips were typically wrapped in kale or cabbage leaves and then baked in ashes or at the edges of a hearth. This was a pretty rustic method, but it would help to soften the turnip, and it let the herbs introduce some much-needed flavor. Of course, you had to be very careful that what you were doing wasn't going to burn the turnips. Monasteries were most commonly known for preparing turnips, and they relied pretty much entirely on olive oil and butter. This resulting dish was something that was really earthy and savory, but the herbs helped when it came to the taste of turnips. For some, that taste can be really overwhelming. Break time. 1 second. Die. Chicken fried steak. This classic is long gone but never forgotten. This one's pretty easy to make too. All you need is a chicken steak dredged in a seasoned flour mixture, dipped in a wet batter, and finally coated in a crispy breading. Fry till it's golden brown for the perfect dinner that'll leave you wanting more. Chicken fried steak is typically served with a creamy gravy for dipping, along with mashed potatoes and vegetables for a complete and oh-so-satisfying meal. It is basically American, and the yassified version of the Austrian dish Wiener Schnitzel, and the Italian dish cotoletta alla Milanese. Fancy names, but the same old fried chicken steak. Now I know what you're thinking. Why did this crispy golden goodness leave us too soon? Well, you can trick yourself all you want, but it's not the healthiest dinner out there. But hey, having a fried steak once in a while can't do much harm, right? Just be prepared for some finger-licking good action. This dish is messy, but in the best way possible. When tomato sauce wasn't in the pantry and butter wasn't an option, a surprising combination stepped in: mayonnaise and mustard. Tossed with hot spaghetti noodles and seasoned with a dash of salt and pepper, this unusual pairing became a quick-fix meal known as mayo and mustard spaghetti, which was both budget-friendly and undeniably memorable. Spaghetti itself was one of the most affordable dry goods available, filling enough to feed a family without requiring much else. Mayonnaise, often stocked in refrigerators for sandwiches and salads, brought richness and a creamy texture, while mustard added just enough tang to keep things interesting. It wasn't gourmet, but it turned plain pasta into something that felt like a complete dish without the need for meat, cheese, or expensive sauces. In working-class households, meals like this weren't about following a recipe. They were about making do with what was available. Kids grew up eating it straight from the pot, a quick meal before heading outside to play or finishing homework at the kitchen table. It may not have been a dinner guests would rave about, but for those who remember it, the taste still lingers as a reminder of simpler times and just how far a few basic ingredients could go. Pick your favorite weird Betty Crocker dinner. Drop it in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more forgotten food fun.